It's so good. This is one of the best features on the higher end Nikon bodies. Having two focus modes at the same time is amazing. Hey, so in this video I'm going to be going over my camera settings as promised from my last video. So when you buy a new camera, it comes with like a factory default setting, and we like to go in and change things and have different setups and different modes and stuff. So in this video I'll be sharing my setup, but more importantly I'll be trying to show why I use these settings and give some examples and things like that. The idea is that hopefully it'll give you some ideas on how you can set up your camera, maybe some tricks here and there that you weren't aware of. I use a Nikon D850 with a 500mm lens most of the time. Most of the settings that I'll be showing should work on, I would say, most DSLR and mirrorless cameras. There might be a few settings here and there, but you should be able to get it close at least. And my goal when I'm setting up a camera for wildlife or any kind of shooting really is to just have a setup that is flexible, works in lots of different situations, and if you need to make quick changes and things like that, it's easy to do. So if you're shooting another brand, Canon, Sony, you should be able to, for the most part, copy this setup or some of the features and get a similar setup. If you shoot Nikon, in particular if you shoot some of the higher end models like the D850, then I think you'll like some of these setup tips. So let's get into it. So first things first, image quality, I set it to RAW. JPEG is a processed, compressed file. It's designed for sharing and things like that. It's not really designed for editing. RAW, on the other hand, you can think of it sort of like a snapshot of all of the information that was on the sensor at the time you took the picture. So there's no processing done. It's just like you take that snapshot of the sensor and you save all of that data straight onto the memory card. And that's amazing for editing because it contains so much more information than a JPEG file, and it's also unprocessed, so you can do all of your own processing, make it look the way you want with a lot more flexibility. I would generally recommend shooting RAW if you want the most detail possible, even if you're not interested in editing, but you will need some kind of RAW editing software to open and mess with the files. I use Lightroom. If you're not sure, I'd recommend choosing RAW plus JPEG. That way you have both. So let's get onto the mode. I use manual mode with auto ISO. If you think about it, the ISO setting is kind of the least important one because your aperture and your shutter speed are actually physical ways of allowing more light to reach the sensor. So they're really influencing your exposure. The ISO is essentially like you're taking all of that light that the sensor is capturing and then you're just boosting it up to the right brightness. So there's not really that much use in controlling the ISO yourself unless you're doing something really specific like maybe landscape photography, or if you're in some other situation where you have your settings really dialed in and you don't want them to change. But when you're out in the field, you're going around to different areas, you're shooting different subjects, you just want to be able to change things like aperture and shutter speed and not worry about the ISO and let the camera deal with it. You just have to keep an eye on it to make sure that it doesn't go too low or too high. So I think some people have this idea that shooting high ISO is bad because it means your images will be noisy. Image noise isn't really determined by the ISO, it's determined by the total amount of light hitting the sensor. So that means the way to reduce noise is to actually get more light to hit the sensor. So that means opening your aperture wider or using slower shutter speeds. In some cases, you just can't avoid having high ISO noisy images because your shutter speed has to be high. So don't fight ISO, just let it go as high as it needs to. And as long as you're controlling the manual controls properly, that's just as good as it's going to get with your lens. There's not really that much you can do about it. And you might think like, well, manual mode is hard because you've got all these different settings you need to mess with. Not really, actually. So most of the time the lens is going to be wide open if you're doing wildlife photography because you usually have a long lens with not a very big aperture, like maybe f5.6, f4, f6.3, things like that. And you usually use quite a high shutter speed as well. So actually you just set your lens to wide open, which is on my camera, it's this front dial. And once the lens is wide open, the only thing you have to worry about is the shutter speed. And I'd recommend that people get used to using the shutter speed in day-to-day photography, because you'll quite quickly get used to what shutter speeds you can use in different situations, things like that. For example, in my case, I know that most of the time I can have my shutter speed at 1/250th of a second, and it'll be a good shutter speed in like loads of different situations in wildlife photography, also in other things as well, but it's like a good starting point. And then if I'm shooting birds in flight, I'll put it way up to like 1/2000th of a second, maybe even higher. And if I'm shooting in sort of a bit lower light and the animals are keeping quite still, I might drop the shutter speed down to 1/125th, 1/60th, whatever you feel comfortable hand holding with your lens. So just to summarize, the aperture is basically set and forget. I'll just set it wide open and then for the most part never really change it. But if I need to, it's just the front dial. And then the shutter speed, I'll be tweaking that constantly as I'm shooting, depending on the situation. That's sort of the most important setting for me. And the ISO will be adjusted automatically by the camera, and if I need to override it, I'll use a bit of exposure compensation. So that's manual mode plus auto ISO. Okay, white balance. So I just set it to cloudy and almost never change it. There's something about cloudy white balance. It just sort of looks good in most situations. If you're in cloudy conditions, obviously it'll look fine because that's what it's meant for. If you're in sunny conditions, it might look a little bit warm. I don't really mind that because I find that the sunny white balance often looks a bit too cool. And then if you're in shade or if the sun has gone down, it'll start to take on a bit more of like a blue tone. And I actually really like this because I'll give an example. I took a picture of a fox a little while back and it was after sunset, so it was dusk. And you can see in the picture that it was dusk because of the blue tint. If I'd just used auto white balance or set the white balance correctly, it just would have looked like a normal scene with no interesting mood. So that's really the thing with white balance. There's such a thing as correct white balance, but then there's sort of like the more artistic white balance where you try to show a bit more of the mood of the scene. So this is why, for me, it works to just leave it in cloudy all the time. And because I'm shooting RAW, I can just go in and change the white balance in my RAW editing software, and it's very easy and you don't lose any quality when you do it, so it's great. Okay, so metering. So the camera's metering mode. When you point your camera at a scene, basically the camera's doing a load of work in the background to try and work out what the correct exposure should be. And on Nikon, so there's something called matrix metering. I just leave it on matrix metering all the time. Like maybe very occasionally I'll change it if I'm shooting like white birds flying around or light colored things. In that case, I might set it to highlight weighted metering, which tries to expose for the brightest thing in the scene. But at the same time, I could just use exposure compensation to achieve the same thing. So yeah, pretty much just leave it in matrix metering. That's great. Okay, so the shutter release mode. So this is actually on my Nikon D850. It's this little dial up here, and the shutter mode is basically different modes when you press the shutter button. Like the one I have it on most of the time is called continuous quiet, QC, and it sounds like this. Basically, it's just like a continuous mode with a slightly softer, quieter shutter. That's in contrast, continuous high sounds like this. So that's continuous high. That's continuous quiet. So it's not really that it's quieter, but it is like a little bit of a less jarring sound, and I think it's less likely to scare animals, so I like to use that. The other reason I like to use it is because it jolts the camera a bit less, and I think that helps a bit with like shooting at slow shutter speeds. But then if I'm shooting action, I'll just bump it up to continuous high to get the nice high frame rate for like birds in flight and things like that. And I'm not too sure about other brands, but for Nikon, most of the mid-range and up cameras should have continuous quiet. And if you have a mirrorless camera like a Sony or something like that, then you probably actually have a silent mode already built in, so that would be even better. And a little trick that's specific to the D850, you can enable the electronic first curtain shutter to work in quiet continuous or quiet. If you have the D850 and you shoot wildlife, I'd recommend trying this because I find that it lets you shoot at even lower shutter speeds, because it flips up the mirror and opens the shutter and then pauses for like a split second before starting the exposure electronically. And that means that you get a little bit less camera shake than you would if you were using the shutter normally. The maximum shutter speed you're limited to is 1/2000th of a second, which isn't actually that much of a problem because usually when you're in continuous quiet, you're shooting at slower shutter speeds anyway. And if you're shooting at really high shutter speeds, then you might want to switch over to continuous high. All right, so autofocus. So this is where it gets a little bit interesting, I guess. So I use back button focus with a twist. I'll go over that in a minute, but basically back button focus. So one of the benefits is you don't necessarily want the camera to refocus every time you try to take a picture. With back button focus, the camera only focuses when you press the back button. It doesn't ever try to focus when you press the shutter button, and that can be really useful in some situations. I mean, I like back button focus for all different types of photography, but it does have some good applications in wildlife. For example, if you're trying to photograph a bird in a tree and it's kind of like in between some leaves and branches and it's kind of hard to focus on, you don't want the camera to try and refocus every time you press the shutter. You want to be able to carefully focus once and then continue to like take shots without the camera possibly hunting and messing up your focus point. Another benefit to back button focus is that it gives you all three focus modes in one. If you want to use single focus, AFS, you press the button, wait till it's focused, and then let go, and then take your shot. If you want to use continuous focus, you hold down the button, and then you can continue to take pictures, and it will continue to track. If you want to use manual focus, you simply don't touch the back button, and then just manually focus the lens. So it basically saves you from ever having to switch between different focus modes. Yeah, back button focus is great if you're the sort of person who likes having like proper control of your camera and you don't want it doing weird things on its own. Set up back button focus and I think you'll really like it. And I think there are other things that I haven't even mentioned, like you don't really know what the benefits are until you start using it, and you'll see little things here and there that add up. If you want to set up back button focus, I would recommend Googling the settings for your particular camera, because every camera has a slightly different way of setting it up. Even within Nikon, there are like different bodies have slightly different ways of setting up back button focus. But when it's set up properly, the shutter button won't try to focus when you half press it. The back button will, and it should be on continuous mode. For the AF area mode, I use group area AF, which is like a diamond pattern that you can move around, and I find this works great for like quickly acquiring a subject, fast moving things. And if I'm trying to be a bit more precise and get focus right on the eye of my subject, I'll use single point AF. So you may have to switch between those two focus modes, but I do have a trick for this on some higher end Nikon bodies, which I'll go over in a second. And so for the twist is I use back button focus in conjunction with another feature that I call front button focus. I don't know if it has an official name, but on some higher end Nikon bodies, the D850, the D500 and the D5 I think can all do this. They allow you to set one of the front function buttons, like these buttons inside the grip, to essentially act as an AF button. Not only that, but when you press it, it'll switch to a mode that you've predetermined. So what that means for me is when I press the front button, the group area AF that I usually use, which is like a diamond shape, will turn into a single point and then focus. And this is really super handy because it means that when you use the back button normally, you have your group area AF, which is like a little bit of a bigger focus area. It's really fast. It's great for quick subject acquisition. And then if you want to get in a bit tighter and focus a bit more precisely right on the eye of your subject, then you hold down the front button and you get the single point AF. And it also fixes another problem. Back button focus has one downside, and that is when you're holding down the back button, you can't move the joystick around while you're focusing because you only have one thumb, right? But with front button focus, you can. So yeah, front button focus in conjunction with back button focus is kind of the best of both worlds. It means that you always have access to single point AF to get nice and precise on the eye of your subject. But then your main focus mode with back button focus, you can switch that to different modes. You might want to switch between, say, group area AF and 3D tracking, and you still have that front button that always has the ability to punch in and get that single point AF. It's so good. This is one of the best features on the higher end Nikon bodies. Having two focus modes at the same time is amazing. Okay, so image playback. So earlier I was talking about some of these controls down the left hand side of the camera. This is mostly related to image playback. So on my D850 I do have a way of doing this all with my right hand. There are two buttons inside the grip. So the top one, as I went over earlier, is for front button focus. The bottom one I set to image playback. So when I press that lower button, it opens up the last image that I took. This is just a shot out of my window a few minutes ago. I just wanted something with detail to show this technique. So I set the center button of the D-pad to punch into 100% zoom. And this is great because it means that without even taking your hand off the lens, you can open up the last picture you took, and then you can punch into 100% zoom and see the focus point and check that it's sharp. And then you can use the rear scroll dial to like switch between pictures, and you can use the front scroll dial to switch between 10 pictures. I think by default, when you take a picture, it'll just pop up the last picture you've taken. I don't really like that. It's kind of distracting, it wastes battery. So I just set it, so the front button opens up the last picture. So yeah, I would highly recommend setting this up. It just saves time, it makes things a bit less frustrating. Oh, and by the way, you can also use the joystick center button. You can like click the joystick in. If you have your lower front button set to something else, then you can use that instead. I guess I could quickly go over the settings I use on the lens. So VR mode, I generally have that set to normal. If I'm shooting something moving or if I'm like panning, I'll set it to VR Sport, which is like a bit more designed for like panning and smooth movement. There's a switch at the top which is like AM, MA and M. That basically controls the priority that the AF system has over the focus ring. So most of the time you'll want that set to AM, which means that the autofocus will have priority over the zoom ring. Basically, if you accidentally nudge or bump the zoom ring, the AF system won't get thrown off. It'll actually adjust it and make sure that it stays in focus. But if you had it set to MA, then anytime you just slightly nudge the focus ring, it would actually override autofocus and you'd suddenly like lose focus on whatever you were focusing on. So yeah, I use AM. So there we go. Those are my settings for my Nikon D850 for pretty much all of my wildlife shooting, and I find these settings work pretty well in other things as well, like portraits and stuff like that. Camera settings are really personal, so obviously other people are going to have different ways they do things. That's fine. Of course, if you want to, you can go in and completely copy all of my settings, but that's not really what this video is intended to be. It's just more of an example of how I set up my system, and then if you find some techniques that I'm using that you like, you can incorporate them into your workflow as well. So if you have any questions about my setup, feel free to leave a comment below. So if you like this video, hit the like button. Make sure you subscribe because I will have more videos like this coming out in the future. So I was just editing this video and I realized that I actually missed out a setting. So as a thank you to anyone who made it all the way to the end, here's a final bonus tip that'll just help speed up your shooting a little bit more. So the tip is set your exposure dial steps to half a stop instead of a third of a stop, which it is by default. I think you'll find it nice how much faster it is to be able to scroll through different shutter speeds and apertures with this setting. So yeah, I'd highly recommend you try it out, especially if you're shooting RAW, because you can easily tweak the exposure in post. You don't really have to worry about those fine adjustments in camera. Alright, yeah, I guess that's really the end of the video now, so thanks so much. Catch you in the next one.